The compartment smelled exactly the same. That was the first thing Ginny noticed. That particular Hogwarts Express smell. A layered thing she'd never been able to properly describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. Old wood and something faintly metallic from the window latches, and underneath it all, the ghost of every pumpkin pasty ever eaten on this train since 1935, or whenever it had started running. She'd always found it comforting before, a smell that meant you're going back. Today it sat in her chest slightly wrong, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. She'd chosen a compartment near the middle of the train, not too far back, not too close to the front where the prefects clustered, and everything felt official and observed. She'd put her bag on the seat beside her without quite meaning to. The international signal for "please don't sit here," which she immediately felt guilty about, and then immediately felt annoyed at herself for feeling guilty about. She was allowed to want a quiet journey. She was allowed to want exactly one morning that didn't require anything from her. The platform had already been difficult enough. Her mum had held on too long at King's Cross. Not embarrassingly long. Her mum knew better than that, especially this year. But long enough that Ginny had felt the specific tremor in her arms that meant she was holding something back. Her dad had kissed her forehead and said, "Right soon," which was what he always said. But this time his voice had a careful quality to it, like he was pronouncing each word deliberately. George hadn't come. That was fine. That was completely understandable and fine. She'd walked through the barrier and onto the platform and stood there for a moment, in the noise and the steam, and the first thing she'd thought, before she'd had time to stop herself, was, "He's not here." Which was not a surprise. She knew Harry wasn't here. He was in London, probably still sleeping at Grimmauld Place at this hour, probably doing something ordinary and unmagical like making toast. He'd offered, gently and twice, to come to King's Cross anyway, just to see her off. She'd told him not to. This wasn't about him. Coming back to Hogwarts needed to be her thing. Something she did under her own weight, or it wouldn't mean anything at all. She still noticed his absence on the platform. That was the unfair part. You could make the right decision and still feel the shape of what wasn't there. The train lurched forward just after 11, and outside the window, London began to unspool itself. The backs of terraced houses, alleys, a dog barking at something in a garden. Ginny watched it go. She'd always liked this part of the journey, the way the city gradually loosened its grip and gave way to open countryside, greens and greys, and the occasional startled sheep. It usually made her feel like she was moving towards something. Today, it just felt like movement. The door of her compartment slid open. She looked up, already arranging her face into something neutral. It was Neville, recognizable even through the slight awkwardness of having grown perhaps an inch over the summer, wearing a brown jumper that looked like Mrs. Longbottom had knitted it specifically to be endured. He had his toad, Trevor's empty cage, tucked under one arm, which meant Trevor had already escaped and the search had apparently been postponed. Ginny, he said it with relief, which made her feel immediately warmer toward him than she'd expected. Not Ginny Weasley or anything loaded, just Ginny, like she was simply a person he was glad to see. Neville. She moved her bag. He sat down across from her and set the empty cage on the seat beside him, without comment. Outside, London had fully dissolved into Hertfordshire. "Trevor's gone again," he said. "I noticed. He was there this morning, on the platform, and then—" He made a small, helpless gesture. "I think he might actually prefer King's Cross, which is a sad thing to consider about a toad." Ginny almost smiled. "Maybe he knows something we don't." Neville looked at her, and for a moment there was something careful in his expression. A small recognition, the kind that passed between two people who'd been through the same thing without needing to compare notes. Then it softened into something easier. He leaned back against the seat. "How was your summer?" he asked. And it was a real question, which was somehow both better and harder than a polite one. "Strange," she said. "Quiet, mostly. The house was—" She stopped, started again. Mum kept cooking too much food, like she kept forgetting how many people were there. Neville nodded once. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," which she was grateful for. He'd lost people too. He understood that "I'm sorry" eventually started to feel like a stone you had to acknowledge and then carry, and sometimes you just needed someone not to hand you another one. "Gran kept all the curtains closed for a month," he said. She said it was because of the heat. It wasn't because of the heat. "No," Ginny agreed. They sat with that for a moment, and it was all right. The train swayed gently, and outside the sky had gone the particular grey-white of early September, the kind of sky that couldn't quite decide between summer and autumn, and had settled into an uncertain truce. The compartment door opened again. This time, it was a pair of fourth years Ginny didn't recognize. She'd know their faces eventually. She knew it would come back. But right now, the rosters were all shuffled in her head. They stopped in the doorway, and she saw it happen, the exact moment they recognized her. Their conversation stopped mid-sentence. The taller one's mouth did something odd. The shorter one stared with an expression that was clearly meant to be subtle, and was not even slightly subtle. "Sorry," the taller one said. "We were just looking for a seat." "There's space in the next carriage," Neville said, pleasantly but firmly. He wasn't looking up from his hands. "Right, yeah." They backed out. The door slid shut. Ginny looked at the window. "Thank you," she said. "I used to get it after the Carrows thing," Neville said simply. "People looking at you like you're, I don't know, a portrait of yourself." That was exactly it. That was the precise thing she hadn't been able to name all morning. A portrait of yourself, not entirely real, a fixed image people carried around and held up against you, comparing. "I don't want to be brave today," she said. It came out very flat, which wasn't quite what she'd meant, but it was true. Neville considered this. "You don't have to be. It's just a train." "It won't just be a train when we get there." "No," he admitted. "Probably not." She turned back to the window. The countryside was properly itself now. Wide fields, hedgerows, a farmhouse with smoke coming from the chimney, even though it wasn't cold enough for that yet. Someone's ordinary life, passing at 60 miles an hour. She thought about what going back had meant in previous years. First year, terror and wonder in roughly equal measure. Second year, the terrible private knowledge of the diary, the things she'd done, the months she still couldn't look at without flinching. Third year, the shakiness of a year survived. Fourth, watching the Triwizard Tournament with her heart in her mouth. Fifth, the DA in Room of Requirement, learning to cast a Patronus in a small group of people who trusted each other in the specific way that shared fear creates. 6th, the year everything shifted, Harry's hand in hers on the Quidditch pitch, the world feeling briefly, shockingly possible. 7th, not at Hogwarts, under occupation, the Carrows, a year she didn't think about in sequence, only in flashes. And now, this, September 1998, the first year of whatever came after. She'd almost not come back. That wasn't something she'd said aloud to anyone, not even Harry. She'd stood in her room at the Burrow in late August and thought, seriously and quietly, that she could simply not go. She was 17. She didn't have to go back. She could find other ways to sit her NEWTS. There were provisions McGonagall had written to say so. She could stay home and help her mum with the too much food and keep the curtains open and visit George and not have to walk down corridors that she'd run down in the dark while people she knew were dying. But she'd packed her trunk. She'd gotten on the train. She wasn't entirely sure yet whether that had been the right choice or just the familiar one. Down the corridor, she could hear Neville's voice suddenly. "Ah, there you are." And then the sound of the compartment door sliding back. He returned holding Trevor with the expression of a man who has made his peace with absurdity and tucked him back into the cage. "He was 3 compartments down," Neville said. In with the Hufflepuff prefects, apparently just sitting there. Socializing. Apparently. He sat back down. "You know, I was reading about toads, common toads specifically, Trevor's sort, and they have a reasonably good homing instinct. They return to the same breeding pond every year, sometimes traveling miles. So in a way, Trevor coming back to the cage is..." "Neville." "Yes?" "I appreciate what you're doing." He stopped. Then, quietly, "Is it helping?" She thought about it. Outside the window, a village was passing, a church, a green, someone cycling along a road that ran parallel to the tracks for a moment before curving away. "A bit," she said. "Yeah." He nodded and went back to watching Trevor with the expression of someone who had decided that companionable silence was a skill worth cultivating. Further down the train, she could hear the food trolley beginning its run, the familiar rattle and the woman's voice calling out, "Anything from the trolley, dears?" And students moving in the corridor, and somewhere a laugh that was too loud for 9 in the morning, but genuine, which meant at least some people were managing ordinary. That was something. A little after 1 o'clock, a girl appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 12, maybe just turned 13. Small and slightly anxious looking, in Hogwarts robes that still had the stiff look of new purchase. A second year, Ginny thought. Someone who had been at Hogwarts last year, which meant she'd been there under the Carrows, which meant she'd had her own version of a year Ginny didn't want to think about in sequence. The girl stood in the doorway, holding a chocolate frog card she'd clearly been reading, and she looked up, and she saw Ginny, and she went entirely still. Ginny watched the recognition move across her face. It was slightly different from the 4th year's recognition. There was less awe in it, more something else, something more complicated. "Sorry," the girl said. "I was just... there's nowhere else to sit." Ginny looked at Neville. He gave a small shrug that meant your call. "Come in," Ginny said. The girl sat down carefully in the corner, tucking herself against the window. She held the chocolate frog card in both hands and looked at it as though it had suddenly become very interesting. After a moment, she said, without looking up, "My brother says you're the one who kept Dumbledore's army going last year." "Some of us did," Ginny said. "It wasn't just me." The girl was quiet. Then, "He says you were the only one the Carrows were properly scared of." Ginny felt something move through her that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite discomfort. It settled somewhere in between. "Your brother exaggerates," she said. "What's his name?" "Michael. He was in 6th year. He left in May when—" She stopped. "He's all right," she added, quickly, as though Ginny had asked. "Good," Ginny said. The train rounded a long curve, and the angle of the light shifted, and for a moment the inside of the compartment was very bright and then softened again. The girl went back to her chocolate frog card. Neville made some quiet comment about Trevor that made the girl smile. Very briefly, a small startled expression like she'd forgotten smiling was currently available. Ginny looked back at the window. The countryside was wilder now, further north, the hills longer and lower, the fields rougher, the sky beginning to layer itself in the way that meant Scotland was getting closer. She'd always thought the landscape knew, somehow, that it prepared itself, grew more ancient feeling as you approached, gave you time to shift into a different mode. She thought, "I don't want to be a symbol." Then she thought, "I don't think you get to choose that part." Then she thought, "But maybe you choose what you do with it." She wasn't sure about that last one. It felt like the kind of thing that was true and also easy to say when you were sitting on a train and hadn't arrived yet. She'd find out if it held up once the castle was in front of her. The girl fell asleep somewhere around the Scottish border, her cheek against the window, the chocolate frog card still in her hand. Neville said quietly, "She was in the group that used the room of requirement as a hiding place after Easter." Ginny looked at her, at the slight tension even in sleep, the set of her shoulders, the way her free hand had closed. "I thought she might have been," Ginny said. They didn't say anything else. The train ran on, and the hills outside darkened gently as the clouds thickened, and somewhere ahead, at the end of this, the castle was waiting. Repaired, according to the letters, in good order, much as you remember it, McGonagall had written. Much as you remember it, Ginny would see about that. The boats were gone. That was the first thing Ginny noticed when the carriages crested the hill and Hogwarts appeared below. The lake was there, flat and dark in the early evening light, and the castle was there, lit from within, its towers standing exactly as they always had. But there were no first years in boats. The tradition had been suspended this year. McGonagall had written in the welcome letter, "Given the circumstances of recent events and out of sensitivity to those for whom the crossing may carry difficult associations, the first years would cross next year, once some distance had been established." Ginny understood the decision completely. She was also, unexpectedly, sad about it. The boats had always meant something. That slow crossing in the dark, the castle growing larger ahead of you, the cold air off the water, and the particular silence of 11-year-olds who were too overwhelmed to speak. Something had been suspended along with the tradition. Some ordinary magic that wasn't in any textbook. She didn't say this to anyone. The carriages were full and close, and she was sitting between Neville and a 7th-year Ravenclaw named Stephen. Something who had the focused look of a person trying very hard not to make eye contact with anyone. The Thestrals moved in their smooth, unhurried way, and Ginny kept her eyes on the castle and let the other students talk around her. She could see the Thestrals now. She'd been able to see them since 5th year, after the Department of Mysteries, well, she'd made her peace with that. You saw them once you'd seen death, which meant this year the carriages were carrying significantly more students who could see them than in any previous year. She wondered if the Thestrals noticed, if they felt, in whatever way Thestrals felt things, the difference in the hands that didn't quite touch them, but knew they were there. The carriages stopped at the castle gates, and everyone poured out into the early evening. The sky above Hogwarts a deep blue-grey, the torches in the entrance brackets already lit. The smell of the grounds hit her first, wet grass and the mineral coldness of the lake, wood smoke from somewhere, the particular clean darkness of Scottish autumn beginning. She stood for a moment outside the carriage and breathed it in, and it was the most honest moment she'd had all day. No performance in it, no one watching, just Hogwarts smelling like itself. Then the crowd moved, and she moved with it. The entrance hall was fine. It was fine. She'd prepared herself for this, or tried to. The stone floors, the marble staircase, the hourglasses showing house points in the alcoves. Everything where it had always been. The high ceiling with its torchlight and shadow. She'd stood in this entrance hall 100 times. She'd also stood in it the night of May 2nd, when it had been full of the dead and the injured and the terrible waiting silence of a battle that hadn't quite ended yet. She made herself walk through it at a normal pace, not fast, not slow, normal. The echoes of her footsteps sounded like footsteps. McGonagall was standing at the entrance to the Great Hall. She stood with the particular upright stillness that had always been McGonagall's natural posture. Shoulders back, hands clasped, tartan trim of her robes very crisp. She was greeting students as they came in, a word or two to each. No grand gesture, just her eyes going to each face with a recognition that was quiet and genuine, the look of someone counting up who had come back. When Ginny reached her, McGonagall held her gaze for a moment. "Miss Weasley," she said. Her voice was exactly as it always had been, precise, contained, carrying the faintest warmth underneath like heat through stone. "Professor." A pause. A single, small pause that held more than either of them would say in the entrance hall of Hogwarts, with 100 students pressing in around them. "It's good to have you back," McGonagall said. It was what she'd said to everyone. Ginny had heard her say it 6 times before her own turn. But the way she said it to Ginny, with that specific, careful weight, made it mean something different. Not "we're glad you're a symbol," not "the school is grateful," something more like, "I know what this cost. I know you're here anyway." "Thank you, Professor," Ginny said, and moved into the Great Hall. The Great Hall was loud and lit and full, the 4 long tables already filling up, candles floating as they always had, the enchanted ceiling showing the cloudy September evening sky above. Ginny stood for a moment in the doorway and looked at it, making herself look at it properly. It looked almost exactly as it had. The tables, the benches, the shimmer of goblets, the noise of several hundred students talking all at once. She had eaten thousands of meals in this room. She'd done homework here on slow afternoons, argued with her brothers here, learned from watching the older students what being at Hogwarts actually meant. She'd also walked into this room in the grey morning of May 2nd and seen bodies laid in rows along the side walls. And she had not walked to the Gryffindor table, and walked to the Gryffindor table, and sat down. Neville settled in beside her. Luna appeared from somewhere. She did that, materialized at your elbow without quite seeming to have travelled there, and sat across from them with the placid expression of someone who had decided that reality was generally manageable if you approached it without too many expectations. "I like what they've done with the ceiling," Luna said. "It's the same, but somehow more deliberate, as though it's trying harder." Ginny looked up. The ceiling moved with slow cloud, the last pale light of the September evening. "It looks the same to me." "Yes," Luna agreed serenely. "That's the deliberate part." Ginny had no response to that. She poured herself some water. The sorting happened. A new group of first years, smaller than usual, which was the war too, all those families who'd kept their children home or couldn't send them, all those children who would be 1 year behind now. The Sorting Hat song this year was quieter than she remembered from her first year, less theatrical. It said something about broken things that know their own strength, which made the great hall go briefly silent in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just honest. She watched the first years walk to the stool and have the hat placed on their heads one by one, their faces cycling through terror and concentration, and then sudden relief as the hat called out and the table for their house erupted. She'd had that moment herself a long time ago. She tried to remember what it had felt like and found she could only get the surface of it, the scratchy fabric of the hat, the dark of it over her eyes, the sound of her name being called, and then Gryffindor roaring around her. She'd been so certain then, or at least she'd wanted to be, that she belonged here, that she was brave enough, that she was a Weasley, and Weasleys were Gryffindors, and that meant something clear. She still thought she was brave enough. She just knew now that bravery wasn't a fixed state. It was something you had to keep deciding toward, sometimes several times in a single morning. And some mornings it was harder than others. And that didn't mean you'd lost it. It just meant you were tired, and being tired was allowed. The feast appeared. She filled her plate mechanically and ate, which was something. The food was very good. It was always very good. The Hogwarts kitchens were consistent, if nothing else. And eating helped ground her in the present tense, in the ordinary physical reality of sitting at a table and being hungry, and then less hungry. Around her, conversations moved in the way that first night conversations always moved. Where did you spend the summer? Have you heard about the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor? What are you taking? For NWTS. Did you see that the Chudley Cannons had another appalling season? She let it flow around her, contributing occasionally, not forcing it. Neville talked to the boy on his other side about herbology practical requirements. Luna told someone a thing about water creatures that Ginny was almost certain wasn't true, but that the someone was listening to with polite fascination. Partway through the meal, she became aware that someone further down the table was looking at her. She'd noticed it before. This year would have this. She'd known that coming in. The looking. She'd been looked at since the end of the war in a way that was different from being Ron Weasley's younger sister or Harry Potter's girlfriend, both of which had their own complicated visual weight. This was more direct. She was a person who had done a specific thing in a specific year, and some people wanted to look at that, wanted to locate it in a face they could actually see. This one was a fifth-year boy she recognized. Distantly, Oliver something, Gryffindor, had been in his fourth year during the bad year. He looked away when she met his eyes, color rising in his neck. She looked back at her food. She understood it. She did. When she'd been younger, she'd looked at older students who'd done impressive things the same way, searching their faces for whatever quality had made them capable of it, as though you could see courage from the outside if you looked carefully enough. She'd done it herself. It didn't make it easier to be on the receiving end. What she wanted to say to everyone who looked at her like that was, I was scared. I was scared most of the time, and I did it anyway, and I didn't always do it gracefully. And there were nights I cried into my pillow and wanted my mum. And that is what bravery actually looks like. It looks like ordinary frightened people doing things anyway. She knew it was important, that version. She knew it was probably more useful than the other version, the portrait of herself version that people seem to prefer. But she was very tired, and it was only the first evening, and she had 6 months ahead of her in which to be useful. After the feast, McGonagall stood and gave a short address. Clear voice, measured pace. She mentioned the repairs to the castle, completed over the summer, the work of the staff and of volunteer contractors, both magical and muggle. She mentioned the counselling available through Madame Pomfrey's office and through a visiting specialist from St. Mungo's. She mentioned that the year would proceed as normally as possible, that examinations would take place on their standard schedules, that Quidditch would resume in October. She did not make a speech about loss or resilience, or what Hogwarts meant, or what they'd all been through. She mentioned the Battle of Hogwarts once, briefly and directly, and said that there would be a memorial observance in May on the anniversary. Details to follow. And then, she said, you will find the castle much as you remember it, I hope. And I hope that brings some comfort, and sat down. Ginny sat with that. Much as you remember it. She thought about the ceiling that was the same, but somehow more deliberate, and thought that McGonagall probably understood that, and had said much as rather than exactly as with full awareness of what she was doing. She was a precise woman. She chose her words. After the meal, the prefects led the way to the common rooms, and Ginny walked with the Gryffindors up through the castle. She'd made herself a private promise before she'd come back. She would not brace herself at every corner. She would not preemptively manage every doorway or corridor. She would walk through the castle normally and let it be the castle. And if something hit her sideways, she'd deal with it then, not before. She kept the promise until the second-floor corridor. There was a section of wall there, about 12 feet long, running between 2 windows, where the stone was different. Not wrong, exactly, just slightly newer looking. Lighter in colour, the mortar between the stones more uniform. You could see where the old stonework ended and the repair began if you knew where to look. And Ginny knew where to look because she'd been standing 30 feet away when a Death Eater's curse had taken out that section of wall and the window beside it and the 2 Hogwarts students who'd been crouching beneath it. She knew their names. She would always know their names. She stopped walking. The students behind her moved around her in the corridor, a brief parting like a stream around a stone. And then she was standing still, and the crowd was thinning, and it was just her and the repaired wall. She looked at it. The stones were Hogwarts stone. They'd quarried it correctly, matched the color as closely as they could. In 20 years, it would weather, and you'd barely see the difference. McGonagall had done the right thing, repairing it rather than leaving it. She understood that. A school wasn't a monument. Children lived here. You couldn't leave the damage and call it remembrance. But right now, this year, she could see exactly where it was. She put her hand against the new stones. They were cold, the way all castle stone was cold, and smooth, less worn than the original stone, without the slight texture of centuries of air and hands. She held her palm flat against it and thought, I was here. This happened here. I know this. Not as a way to hurt herself with it, but just as a fact she was refusing to look away from. She heard a footstep behind her and took her hand away. Luna was there. Just Luna. Everyone else having continued on. Luna standing a few feet away with her customary, unhurried expression. I noticed you'd stopped, Luna said. Ginny nodded. Luna came and stood beside her, not touching, looking at the wall with the same equanimity she brought to everything, as though repaired castle walls and thestrals and grief were all simply features of the same continuous world that she'd decided to live in without excessive resistance. Do you think the stones remember? Luna asked. Not sadly, genuinely curious, the way she always was. Ginny thought about it. I don't know, she said. The castle probably does, in some way. Yes. Luna tilted her head slightly. I think it does too. But I don't think that means it's haunted. I think it means it's paying attention. Ginny looked at her. The castle is paying attention, Luna said. Which means you don't have to pay attention on its behalf. You can just live in it. It was a Luna thing to say. Sideways, strange, not quite mappable onto anything conventional. And like many Luna things, it lodged somewhere and stayed. They stood there for another moment, the corridor quiet now, the torches casting their warm, unsteady light on the repaired stones and the original stones and the cold air of the castle moving around them. Then Ginny said, Come on. They walked the rest of the way to Gryffindor Tower together, not talking much, which was fine. Luna's silences were never uncomfortable. They were generous, wide-open things that you could rest inside without feeling any pressure to fill them. The fat lady's portrait swung open on the password. Perseverance this year, which Ginny thought McGonagall had probably chosen herself. And the common room was warm and noisy and very orange, and someone had already started a game of exploding snap in the corner. And the fire was high, and the armchairs were exactly where they'd always been. Ginny stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. There was the window seat where she'd sat with Harry after Dumbledore's army meetings. The particular late-night quiet of it. There was the table where she and Hermione had done homework together. Hermione's notes in 4 different ink colours. Ginny's in whatever came to hand. There was the corner where Fred and George had held court for 7 years, where they drafted their best pranks and argued and been categorically, joyfully themselves. The corner was just a corner now. She walked to it anyway and stood there for a moment and felt it, felt the specific shape of that absence, which was different from generic grief, Fred-shaped. irreplaceable in exactly his particular irreplaceable way. Then she went and sat in one of the armchairs by the fire because she was tired, and it was the first night, and she was here, and that was what here meant. Neville appeared beside her a few minutes later with 2 mugs of something warm that the house elves had apparently already anticipated the need for. He handed her one without comment. She held it in both hands. The warmth went through her palms and up her wrists. The common room moved and talked around her, and the fire settled, and somewhere outside the enchanted castle, the September night deepened over the grounds and the lake, and Ginny sat in the chair and drank the warm thing and let herself be simply present in the room where she was. That was enough. For the first night, it was exactly enough. She woke before her dormitory did. That had been happening all summer, this early, involuntary wakefulness, her body pulling her up out of sleep at some hour when the light was still thin and uncertain. Her mum had told her it would pass. Hermione had sent an article from a healer's journal about sleep disruption following traumatic events, which had been genuinely helpful in a Hermione way, meaning it had explained the mechanism thoroughly without quite fixing the thing. Harry had told her he had it too, in the careful voice he used when he admitted to something that made him feel vulnerable, and that had helped most of all. Not the information, just the knowing she wasn't alone in the 5 a.m., ceiling staring. She lay still for a few minutes, listening to the dormitory breathe around her. 4 other girls, in 4 other beds. She knew 3 of them from previous years. The 4th was new to her, a transfer student from Beauxbatons, whose name was Celeste, and who had arrived looking politely bewildered by the general aesthetic of Gryffindor Tower. They were all still sleeping, which was normal. It was early, but Ginny had that feeling she always had in these first waking minutes of being slightly outside the regular rhythm of the world, slightly ahead of it, standing in a moment that hadn't quite been claimed yet. She got up quietly, dressed in the grey half-light, and went down to the common room. It was empty except for the fire, which had banked itself overnight to a steady, low burn. She sat in the same armchair she'd taken last night and watched it for a while without thinking anything in particular, which was the best the early mornings offered. This brief window before her mind started its work, before the day arranged itself into things she'd have to do and be. Outside the windows, dawn was happening slowly over the Hogwarts grounds. The lake would be mist at this hour. The owlery would be waking up. Somewhere in the greenhouses, Neville was probably already dressed and thinking about mandrakes. She thought about the day ahead. Defense against the dark arts first, then a free period, then transfiguration after lunch. It was a reasonable first day. She'd had the schedule memorized since McGonagall's letter arrived in August, had known the shape of each day before she'd arrived, which had helped in a small way. The year had a structure she could walk into rather than improvise. Defense against the dark arts was the one she'd been thinking about since August. She knew who was teaching it. His name was Professor Aldrich Holt, appointed over the summer, previously a combat-trained Auror who'd been involved in the resistance network during the war. McGonagall had written about him briefly in the welcome letter. Experienced, thoughtful, committed to the subject as a practical discipline, which was all fine, which was perfectly reasonable. The difficulty was simply that defense against the dark arts was the subject she was best at, had always been best at, had felt most fully herself in. And it was also the subject that was most directly about everything that had happened. Every lesson would live inside the context of the past 2 years, whether she wanted it to or not. You couldn't separate the theory from the experience when you'd had the experience. She'd cast those spells. She'd been in those situations. The textbook would say things, and she'd know what those things actually felt like. She wasn't sure yet whether that would make the subject easier or impossible. Professor Holt was a tall man with the slightly over-controlled posture of someone who'd spent years in situations that required readiness. He was perhaps 40, with a quiet face that gave away less than most faces did. Not unkind, just economical. His classroom had been rearranged from the previous configuration, desks in a loose semicircle rather than rows, which immediately made the room feel less like a lecture and more like a conversation, which Ginny registered without being sure how she felt about it. She sat between Neville and a Gryffindor girl named Priya, third from the left in the semicircle. The class was 7th years only. There were 14 of them, a small group, spanning Gryffindor and Hufflepuff, since the NEWT cohort had been combined this year due to numbers. She recognized most faces. They settled into their seats with a collective, slightly held breath quality, the feeling of a room full of people who weren't entirely sure what this lesson was going to ask of them. Professor Holt stood at the front and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Not to create effect, she thought, just because he was actually looking at them, taking stock, the way you did when you were trying to understand the room before you said anything into it. Right, he said. Welcome. I won't tell you this is going to be a normal year of defense against the dark arts, because I don't think that would be true, and I don't find it useful to begin with something that isn't true. The room was very quiet. What I will tell you is that this course has a practical purpose, and that purpose hasn't changed. You're here because you want to understand how to defend yourselves and others, and that understanding is worth having regardless of what else you've been through. We'll work from that. He paused. I also want to say, once and once only, that I know this year carries weight for many of you that previous years haven't. I'm aware of that. You don't have to perform being fine in this classroom. You do have to do the work. Something shifted in the room. A slight settling, like a held breath partially released. Ginny thought it was probably the most honest opening address a defense teacher had given in the years she'd been attending the class, which was a low bar in some ways given the history of the position. But still, they went through the syllabus. NEWT, content, nonverbal casting, counter-jinx theory, shield charm refinements, advanced Patronus work. She already knew most of it in practice. The knowing in practice was precisely the problem. About 40 minutes in, Professor Holt looked up from the syllabus parchment. I'd like to do something briefly before we close. Not an assessment, more of an introduction. I'd like each of you to tell me one thing about defense magic that you understand now that you didn't understand before this year. He glanced around the semicircle. Not something you learned in a classroom. Something you understand because you've actually had cause to think about it. The room went quiet again, differently this time. Not held breath, but something more inward. people finding their own edges of the question, deciding what they were willing to say and to whom. The first few answers were careful, technical. One Hufflepuff boy talked about reaction time in a way that was clearly accurate, but equally clearly kept at a safe distance from experience. Another girl mentioned something about the importance of non-verbal casting in situations where alerting someone to your intention could be dangerous, which was precisely observed and delivered in a tone that said, "I am giving you the answer, not the context." Ginny was 3 from the end of the semicircle. She watched Professor Holt listen to each person. Really listen, not just waiting for his turn to speak. And she could feel the attention in the room shifting as it moved closer to her. She could feel people not looking at her in the specific way that was itself a kind of looking, a peripheral awareness, a bracing. The girl to Ginny's right finished her answer. 14 pairs of eyes were either on Ginny or carefully not on her, which amounted to the same thing. She had 3 seconds to decide what to say. There was the answer she could give, clean, competent. Something about the relationship between conviction and spell power, something that was true and useful and wouldn't cost her anything in front of a room full of people at 8:45 on a September morning. She had it ready. She'd been preparing it without knowing she was preparing it for the past 40 minutes. "Knowing the spell isn't the hard part," she said. Professor Holt waited. "You can know every counter curse in the book. You can practice until the casting is automatic." She looked at her desk for a moment, then back up. "The hard part is that in a real situation, you're not just casting at a target. You're making a decision about another person every time, and you don't get to think about it for very long, and you don't always feel certain, and the theory doesn't tell you anything about what that actually feels like." The room was very still. "So I suppose what I understand now that I didn't before is that the decision matters as much as the spell, maybe more. And that's the part you can't really practice." She stopped. It was more than she'd meant to say. The room held it for a moment, and then Professor Holt nodded once, not with the exaggerated appreciation of a teacher who is grateful for something to respond to, but simply as someone who had heard something true and was acknowledging it. "That's a useful thing to understand," he said. "Thank you." He moved on to the next person, and everyone did the polite thing of turning their attention forward, and the lesson continued, and Ginny sat with the slightly too exposed feeling of having said something real in front of people before she decided she was ready to. After the lesson, gathering her bag, she heard someone say her name, not loudly, not to her, just a murmur to a friend, and she caught, without meaning to, the words, "She was incredible in there." She left the classroom quickly. Luna was waiting in the corridor, which should have been surprising, but wasn't. Luna's NEWT schedule apparently overlapped in ways that placed her in the right corridors at useful moments. Or possibly, Luna simply arrived wherever she felt she was needed, which Ginny had long since stopped questioning. "How was it?" Luna asked. "Fine," Ginny said. Then, "I talked too much." "I doubt that. I said something real in front of 14 people before I was ready to." Luna fell into step beside her, unhurried. "Is there a right time to be ready to?" "That's extremely unhelpful, Luna." "I know," Luna agreed pleasantly. "But I think you know the answer." They walked down the corridor and out through a side door onto the grounds, because the free period stretched ahead of them, and neither of them had mentioned going anywhere specific. And outside felt better than inside at this particular moment. The morning had cleared. The mist was burning off the lake. The sky was a pale, tentative blue, the air carrying that particular early September quality of not quite having decided whether it was still summer. Ginny felt the outside air on her face, and something in her shoulders released by about half an inch. Everyone looked at me when it was my turn, she said. In the lesson, I could feel them, waiting for me to say something. Yes, Luna said. I expect they were. I don't want to be the person people wait on for answers. What do you want to be? It was a genuine question. Luna always asked genuine questions, stripped of social qualification, which was either exhausting or clarifying, depending on your state of mind. Today, in the open air with the lake ahead of them, it was clarifying. I want to be a person finishing her last year at Hogwarts, Ginny said. I want to sit my NEWTS and play Quidditch and eat breakfast without anyone watching me do it. I want to be ordinary. For a while, I want the ordinary thing back. Luna was quiet for a moment. They'd reached the edge of the lake path, the water flat and pewter-colored, a few ducks investigating something near the bank with professional seriousness. I don't think ordinary comes back exactly as it was, Luna said finally, but I think something else comes. That's more useful than ordinary was anyway. What's that? Normal that you've chosen. She watched the ducks. Instead of normal that you inherited. Ginny thought about that, about the difference between the ordinary she'd had before. Easy, assumed, simply there because she'd grown up inside it. And what it might mean to choose how to be in her own life, having seen the other thing. Having stood in the place where everything that made life ordinary was what you were trying to preserve. She hadn't framed it that way before, as a choice. She'd been thinking about it as a recovery, something taken from her that she was trying to get back. But getting back wasn't quite right, was it? You didn't get back to a place you'd already left. You built something that stood on the same ground. The ducks reached their conclusion about whatever they'd been investigating and moved on with the satisfied air of experts who have completed an assessment. Do you think about it? Ginny asked. The year. Yes, Luna said simply. Not always on purpose. What do you do with it? Luna considered the question with her characteristic unhurried seriousness. I put it somewhere that I can see it from, she said, rather than behind me. I find it's better to know where things are. They stood by the lake for a few minutes without talking. The water moved in small, slight ways. The ripple from the duck's passage, the occasional disturbance from something larger beneath the surface, the gentle, continuous lap at the bank. The giant squid was presumably out there somewhere, doing whatever giant squids did on a quiet Tuesday morning. That was unchanged, at least. That was its own sort of constant. Ginny thought about the Dada classroom, the semicircle of desks, the 14 faces oriented toward her turn. She thought about what she'd said, and whether it had been too much or exactly right, and whether the distinction mattered when the thing was already said. She thought about the girl on the train with the chocolate frog card, about the way she'd fallen asleep against the window with her hand closed, about Neville's. She was in the group that hid in the room of requirement after Easter, about how many people were here this year carrying their own version of the year their own private inventory of what had been asked of them and what they'd done and whether it had been enough. She wasn't the only one walking back into this castle with a weight. She knew that. She'd known it abstractly since the summer. But standing here, having sat in that classroom, having heard those careful answers from 14 people, each deciding how much to say, it was less abstract now. It was 14 specific people with their own specific things. And she was one of them. Not separate from them, not elevated above them, just one person in a semicircle. That helped. Quietly, unexpectedly. That helped more than most of the things that had been meant to help. I said something in the lesson, she told Luna, about the decision mattering more than the spell. That sounds true. It felt too exposed. True things often do, Luna said. At first. Ginny looked at the lake, the pale sky reflected in it, the slight motion of the water, the far bank disappearing into tree line. The castle was behind her, present without pressing. The morning was around her, cool and ordinary and hers. She was tired. She'd been tired since May, and the tired had different textures depending on the day. Sometimes heavy and sometimes just a background hum. But it was there, and she'd stopped fighting it, which was its own small progress. You could be tired and still be here. You could be tired and still be useful and funny occasionally, and yourself. The tired was just one of the things she was carrying this year, not the only one. Luna, she said. Yes? You're a very strange person to talk to. I know, Luna said. Most people find it helpful eventually. Ginny almost laughed. It didn't quite happen, but it was close. The internal shape of a laugh, the feeling of it almost breaking through. That was something. She turned away from the lake and looked back toward the castle. From here, it was simply the castle. Stone and towers and the familiar skyline she'd grown up looking at in photographs before she'd ever stood inside it. It didn't look like the place where the worst night of her life had happened. It looked like Hogwarts. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she was learning slowly that holding two true things at once was less impossible than it had seemed in May. I should go, she said. Transfiguration prep. I know, Luna said. I'll stay here a bit longer. The squid usually comes closer to the surface around this time. Ginny picked up her bag. She looked at Luna once more, at her calm, particular face, at the absolute quality of her attention directed now at the lake surface, with the same focus she gave everything else. There was something useful in the way Luna existed in the world, something Ginny was still working out how to learn from. Thank you, she said, for the walk. I enjoyed it, Luna said, and meant it, clearly, completely, without any of the social performance that made gratitude complicated. Ginny walked back up toward the castle. The morning had fully committed to itself now. The mist gone, the skies settled into September blue, the grounds clear and cool and specific. She walked across the grass with her bag over her shoulder, and she felt tired, still, and slightly too exposed from the lesson, still, and aware of the weight of the year ahead, still. But she was walking toward the castle instead of away from it. And that was a choice she was making with every step. And today, just today, that was enough to be going on with. She skipped her free period on Wednesday. Not dramatically. She didn't announce it, didn't make a decision so much as simply find herself at 10:30, walking away from the castle rather than toward it. Her transfiguration reading was in her bag. She'd meant to find a quiet corner of the library, but the morning was clear and the grounds were mostly empty at this hour. Everyone settled into lessons or common rooms, and her feet took her down the slope toward the lake without her quite authorizing the trip. She led them. The lake path was familiar in the specific way that Hogwarts things were familiar. Not just remembered, but bodily known. The slight unevenness of the ground here, the way the path curved left past the old willow that had lost a major branch sometime in the last year. The sound of the water changing as you got closer, going from ambient to present to immediate. She'd walked this path hundreds of times, with her brothers, with Harry, with the DA on one of their rare outdoor sessions in 5th year, alone, in groups, in the various configurations that 7 years of living somewhere produced. She found the spot she'd been thinking about since King's Cross. It was nothing special to look at. A flattish section of bank, a little setback from the path, partially sheltered by a stand of old reeds that had gone brown at the tips with the early autumn. The grass here was longer than it was closer to the castle, slightly damp even now from the morning, and there was a particular angle to the view across the water that she'd always found steadying. On clear days, you could see the far bank, the tree line, the suggestion of hills beyond. On overcast days, the far side disappeared into grey, and the lake felt limitless, which was unsettling in a way she found oddly useful. Today was clear. She could see everything. She sat down on the bank, pulled her knees up, and looked at the water. The lake, at this hour, was very still. The light came across it at a low angle. September sun, not high enough to flatten the surface, and made small, specific glitterings where it caught. Beneath the surface, the water was very dark, that particular deep green-black of water that has no real bottom visible. She'd always found the lake easier to look at than the sky. The sky was too open. The lake had edges, had a far shore, had a surface you could watch. She sat there and did not think about anything in particular. That was the intention, at least. In practice, thoughts arrived anyway. They always did. You couldn't instruct your mind to simply stop, any more than you could instruct weather to pause. But out here, with the water in front of her and the castle behind her and no one nearby, the thoughts felt different than they did inside. Less pressing, more like weather, and less like obligation. She thought about Fred, briefly and sideways, the way she always did. Not a direct confrontation with the loss, but a peripheral awareness of the shape it left. He'd have had something to say about her sitting by the lake, skipping a free period. Something gently sardonic. Something that made the self-seriousness of the gesture visible, while also managing not to actually undermine the thing that had made her need it. He'd been good at that, better than people gave him credit for. She let that thought pass. She thought about Harry, which was different from missing him. She missed him in a constant background way she'd mostly stopped noticing. The way you stopped noticing a sound that was always there. This was more specific. She'd had a letter from him 2 days ago, written in his slightly cramped handwriting on parchment that had a smudge in the top right corner that was probably ink, but could have been something from Creature's cooking. He'd asked how the packing was going. He'd said that Hermione was being very organized about her own return to Hogwarts, and that it was both admirable and slightly alarming. He'd said, "I hope it's all right when you get there. I think it will be. I think you'll make it all right. She'd read that line several times. I think you'll make it all right. She wasn't sure if that was confidence in her, or pressure on her, or both. Harry meant it as the first thing. She knew that. But it had sat in her chest with a slight weight anyway. The awareness of being believed in by someone who she also needed to believe in her, which was a different thing from someone simply believing in you, slightly more complicated. She was making it all right, she thought. She was here. She was going to her lessons. She was eating and sleeping and talking to people. That was what making it all right looked like from the inside. It was less heroic than the phrase suggested. A heron landed at the water's edge about 20 feet away. It stood with the extraordinary stillness that herons had, that absolute patient suspension, one foot slightly raised, neck curved, watching the water with complete professional attention. She'd seen herons here before. The lake had a small population of them, or possibly just one very determined one that appeared in different places. She'd never been sure. She watched it. There was something useful about watching an animal be entirely itself. No awareness of being observed, no adjustment for audience, no performance. The heron was simply standing at the edge of water in the manner of a heron, which was all it was required to do, and it was doing it completely. She thought, not for the first time, that this was what she was trying to find. Not a version of herself that was appropriate for Hogwarts in the post-war year, not the symbol, or the Weasley, or the girlfriend, or the brave one. Just the version that stood at the edge of things in the manner of herself and needed no further explanation. The heron struck. One movement, absolutely clean. The neck unfolding like something released rather than activated. The beak into the water. And then it was standing again with a small silver fish crossways in its bill. She'd blinked and nearly missed it. The fish disappeared with a slight movement of the heron's head, and then it was still again, watching the water, looking precisely as it had before, except now there was no fish. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You're Ginny Weasley, aren't you?" She startled. She hadn't heard anyone approach. The grass and the distance from the path and her own preoccupation had combined to make the arrival completely unannounced. She turned, one hand already moving toward her wand pocket by reflex, which she stopped because the person standing 3 feet away was approximately 11 years old and wearing Gryffindor robes and an expression of absolute mortification at having startled her. A first-year girl, small, brown-haired, the slightly raw look of someone who had been crying recently, but was not currently crying and was hoping no one would notice. She was holding a textbook against her chest with both arms in the manner of someone who needed something to hold on to. "Sorry," the girl said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I thought you heard me coming. Sorry." Ginny looked at her. The hand that had moved toward her one pocket felt foolish now, and she put it back in her lap with what she hoped was a casual quality. "It's all right," she said. "I was thinking." "I can go," the girl said. She'd already half turned back toward the path. Ginny's first instinct was to let her. The honest, private part of her that had come down to the lake specifically to be alone wanted to say yes, actually, that would be fine, thank you, and go back to watching the heron. But the girl had been crying recently, and she was 11, and it was only the second full day of term. and she was standing on the edge of the lake path, holding a textbook like a shield. "You don't have to," Ginny said. "Sit down, if you want." The girl hesitated for a moment, with the specific hesitation of someone who wants to accept but needs to be sure the offer is real before they commit to it. Then she came and sat down a few feet away, cross-legged, the textbook still in her lap. They were both quiet for a moment. The heron had moved along the bank, was standing further away now, still watching the water with its total professional attention. "First year?" Ginny asked. "Yes." A pause. "It's bigger than I expected. Hogwarts. Everything." She said it with the slightly embarrassed quality of someone admitting something they'd meant to keep private. "I knew it would be big. Everyone says it's big, but knowing and then being here is—" She stopped. "My mum said I'd feel better after the first night. I don't really." Ginny thought about her own first night. The sorting, the feast, the dormitory that had smelled of someone else's soap. The strange specific loneliness of a new place, even when it's exactly where you want it to be. "The first night's not really the marker," she said. "It's more like the first week, or two. The feeling of it being enormous gets—" She searched for the right word. "It doesn't get smaller, but you get better at being inside it." The girl looked at the water. "Were you scared when you came?" "Yes," Ginny said. "I'd heard about it my whole life. All my brothers had been here. I was terrified I'd be the one who couldn't manage it." "Are you one of the Weasleys?" the girl asked, and then immediately looked as though she wished she hadn't. "Sorry, everyone says you're a Weasley. I didn't mean to." "It's fine." Ginny looked at her. "What's your name?" "Maisie. Maisie Fenn." "Gryffindor?" A nod, with a flicker of something. Pride, she thought. The new Gryffindor pride that hadn't quite settled into casualness yet. "Good," Ginny said. They sat for a moment with the water in front of them. A breeze moved across the lake surface, and the glitterings shifted, rearranged themselves, settled again. "My dad says you helped people," Maisie said. "Last year, at school. He said you kept things going when they weren't supposed to be going." Ginny looked at the lake. She'd heard versions of this sentence a lot since May. Each version was true in the sense that it described something that had happened, and each version was slightly wrong in the way that summaries of complicated things were always slightly wrong. Helped people, yes. Kept things going, yes. What those phrases didn't contain was everything around the edges, the fear and the cost, and the nights she hadn't been sure, and the things she'd done that she was still sorting through, deciding which parts she was proud of and which parts were just things she'd had to do that pride wasn't really the right response to. "Some of us did," she said. "It wasn't just me. Dad said you were the one who—" "Your dad exaggerates," Ginny said. "Not unkindly. People do. It's how stories work. They find a name to put at the center, because that's easier than the truth, which is that it was a lot of people doing small things under bad circumstances." She paused. The small things matter. They matter as much as the big things, maybe more. But they're harder to talk about, so the story finds the big thing instead. Maisie was quiet, considering this, with the seriousness of someone who was actually thinking about it rather than just waiting for it to finish. "Do you mind?" she asked. "People talking about it." It was a more direct question than she'd expected from an 11-year-old, and she felt the honesty of it. the way children sometimes ask the thing adults had learned to go around. Sometimes, Ginny said. Not always. I mind it more when I feel like it's turning into something different from what actually happened. When the story starts to be about something simpler than what it was. What was it? Ginny looked at her, at the young open face, the textbook in her lap, the slightly reddened eyes from earlier. It was people being scared and doing things anyway, she said, and sometimes getting it wrong, and sometimes not knowing if what they were doing was helping or not, and coming back the next day and trying again. She looked back at the water. That's what it was. It wasn't clean or clear or the way it sounds when people talk about it. Maisie was quiet for a long time. Then, my mum was in the order. She didn't tell me until after. She said she didn't want me to worry. She picked at the edge of her textbook cover. I was angry about that, not being told. That makes sense. She said she was protecting me. Yes, Ginny said. Parents do that. It comes from the right place, and it can still be the wrong call. She thought of her own mum, of the too much food all summer, of her mum's hands holding on slightly too long at the platform. They're doing their best, the same as everyone. The heron lifted, suddenly, without warning, its wings opening with a sound like a book, dropped on a stone floor, and rose heavily into the air above the lake, circled once in a long, unhurried arc, and then disappeared over the tree line on the far bank. Maisie watched it go. Where do herons go? Wherever they're going next, Ginny said. That's the entire answer, I think. Maisie almost smiled at that. A small, surprised smile. The kind you couldn't quite stop even when you were trying to manage your face. Ginny recognized it. She'd had a version of the same smile twice in the past 2 days, both times when she'd expected not to. They sat for a while longer, not talking much. The lake went on being the lake, the light shifting slightly as the morning moved, the water making its small sounds against the bank, the reeds clicking quietly in the breeze. At some point, Maisie opened her textbook. It was Charms, a first-year edition, very new, the pages not yet creased at the spine, and read with the slightly effortful concentration of someone who was also thinking about other things at the same time. Ginny did not open her transfiguration notes. She sat with the water and the morning and the first-year reading beside her, and she thought about what Luna had said. Normal that you've chosen, instead of normal that you inherited. She thought about what she'd said to Maisie. Small things matter as much as big things. She thought about whether she believed it, and decided that she did, and that it was one of the things she'd learned not from a lesson or a lecture, but from the specific texture of the year that she was still working her way through understanding. She hadn't come to the lake to talk to anyone. She'd come to be alone, to have an hour that required nothing, to sit in the company of the water and let the morning move around her without any demand on her to be anything in particular. But the morning had produced this, a small, crying first year and a conversation about herons and simplicity and scared people doing things anyway. And she found, sitting here now, that she didn't resent it, couldn't. The need that had brought Maisie to the lake path at 10:30 on a Wednesday was not so different from the need that had brought her here. And there was something in the recognizing of that which made the morning feel less like an interruption and more like its own kind of answer. She didn't have to not be herself to be useful to someone else. She could be exactly where she was, doing exactly nothing in particular, and still be the thing that someone needed to sit near for a while. That was smaller than bravery. It was also easier to sustain. "You should probably go back," Ginny said eventually. "You'll have a lesson at 11. Maisie looked at her. "Will you?" "I'll be up in a bit." The girl stood, gathered her charms textbook, and then stood for a moment, looking at Ginny with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing it. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me sit." "Any time," Ginny said, and meant it, which she hadn't expected. Maisie walked back up the path toward the castle, her robes catching slightly in the breeze, her textbook under her arm. Ginny watched her go until she crested the slope and disappeared from sight. Then she turned back to the lake. The water was still there, doing what water did, holding light, holding depth, holding its own surface. The far bank was visible and specific, the tree line clear in the morning air. The heron had not come back, but that was fine. It had been there when it needed to be. She sat for another 20 minutes, just herself and the lake and the slow movement of the September morning. She didn't fix anything or resolve anything. She didn't arrive at a conclusion. She sat with the water and breathed the cool air and felt the damp of the ground through her robes, and was simply a person sitting by a lake at a school she had come back to, in a year that was going to be difficult, and also hers. When she finally got up, her transfiguration note still unread in her bag, she felt steadier than she had when she'd come down. Not fixed, not brave particularly, just steadier. That would do. She found it on Thursday evening. Not deliberately. She hadn't gone looking for it, hadn't even known it was there. She'd been unpacking the last of her trunk, the things she'd left at the bottom because they weren't immediately necessary. Spare parchment, a paperback Muggle novel her father had pressed into her hands at some point over the summer, with the expression of a man offering something he wasn't sure would help but wanted to try. Her old copy of Quidditch Through the Ages, with the spine repaired twice over with spello tape. A handful of things she'd accumulated and not sorted, and simply closed the lid on. And at the very bottom, under a folded jumper she'd forgotten she'd packed, was an extendable ear. She picked it up. It was a Weasley's Wizard Wheezes extendable ear. The flesh-colored cord coiled neatly, the small ear-shaped receiver at one end, the other end tapered to fit against your own ear. She recognized this specific one. She'd had it since the summer before 5th year, when Fred and George had handed them out to everyone at Grimmauld Place so they could listen at doors and hear what the Order was discussing. This one had a small mark on the cord near the receiver end, a dark spot, possibly ink, possibly something from one of the twins' experiments. She'd never been entirely sure. She'd kept it because it was useful, and then kept it because she'd forgotten to give it back, and then kept it because giving it back had stopped being an option. She sat down on the edge of her bed and held it in both hands. The dormitory was empty. The other girls were downstairs. She'd heard them through the floor, the warm murmur of the common room, someone laughing at something. She'd come up to unpack and had meant to go back down. And now she was sitting on her bed holding a Weasley's Wizard Wheezes extendable ear, and the evening had taken on a different quality entirely. She turned it over in her hands. It was a small thing, An ordinary thing, in the context of everything Fred and George had made. She'd grown up surrounded by their products, had watched them develop from garden shed experiments to a proper catalogue, had been the occasional unwilling test subject for the early versions of things that became standard inventory. This wasn't even one of their more inventive items. It was simple, functional, the kind of thing a clever person could have devised. But Fred and George had devised it, and they'd handed it to her on a summer evening at Grimmauld Place, and Fred had said something. She was trying to remember exactly what he'd said. He'd said, "Very useful for eavesdropping on people who think they're being terribly important and secret, which, as you've noticed, is most adults most of the time." And she'd laughed because it was funny, and because Fred at 16 had already had that particular quality of making the serious world slightly less serious without actually dismissing it, which was a more sophisticated trick than it appeared, and which she hadn't fully appreciated until later. She sat with the memory of it, not trying to hold it or extend it, just letting it be there, present for a moment and then gone, the way memories moved when you didn't clutch at them. She missed him in a way that had changed shape over the summer. In May, it had been acute, a sharp, specific pain that arrived without warning and left her unable to do ordinary things for minutes at a time. June had been heavy, a weight that didn't lift so much as become familiar. July and August had been something slower, less sharp, but more constant, a low-grade awareness of absence that was present in the too much food and the curtains and the way her mother sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at the table. And now this, a small cord with an ink mark in the bottom of a trunk on a Thursday evening in a dormitory at Hogwarts. And what she felt was not pain exactly, not the sharp thing or the heavy thing, something more like, "Oh, there you are," the specific texture of missing a specific person. Not Fred as symbol, not Fred as tragedy, not Fred as the twin who was lost. Fred as the person who had said very useful for eavesdropping on adults who think they're terribly important with that particular timing, that particular wryness, the eyebrow that went up with it. Fred as the person whose handwriting was on labels in Weasley's Wizard Wheez's products she'd looked at in August with a feeling she couldn't entirely name. Fred as her brother, ordinary and irreplaceable in the way brothers were, which she had not properly understood until he wasn't there. She didn't cry immediately. She thought she might not cry at all. She'd done quite a lot of crying over the summer, had reached a point somewhere in late July where she'd thought perhaps she'd got through the worst of it, had come out the other side into something more functional. Then she did cry, a little, quietly, without drama, the way grief came sometimes when you weren't braced for it, less like breaking and more like water finding a crack, running through it, going somewhere. She let it happen. She'd learned over the summer that fighting it made it worse. The crying that you resisted became the crying that ambushed you at inconvenient moments, in the middle of breakfast, or talking to someone who didn't know, or standing in the garden doing something completely ordinary. Better to let it happen when it arrived, and it generally passed through in reasonable time and left her feeling wrung out but clear, like weather. She sat on the edge of her bed and cried quietly for a few minutes, holding the extendable ear in both hands, and the evening light through the dormitory window was the particular amber of early September at 6 o'clock, and the sounds from the common room drifted up through the floor, muffled and warm and ongoing. After a while, the crying stopped of its own accord. She sat with the aftermath of it, that specific stillness, the slightly sore feeling behind her eyes, the odd clarity that came after. She looked at the extendable ear in her hands. She thought about Fred's handwriting. She'd been thinking about it intermittently since August, when she'd gone into Diagon Alley with her mum to get school supplies and had passed the Weasleys' Wizard Wheeze's shop. George had reopened it in late July. He'd told the family at dinner, quietly and without making it a big moment, that he thought Fred would have wanted it open. The keeping it closed felt more like giving up than like respect. Her mum had made a noise into her napkin. Her dad had put his hand over George's on the table. She'd looked in the window. She hadn't gone in. She wasn't sure if George would have wanted that. Wasn't sure if she was ready for the smell and the colours and the particular noise of it without Fred's half of the whole equation present. But she'd looked in the window, and there was a product display, and the label in the lower left corner of the display was in Fred's handwriting. She knew his handwriting from George's. Fred's letters slanted more. His G's had a distinctive tail. His capital W was always more elaborate than it needed to be. The label was in Fred's handwriting because Fred had written it, probably 3 years ago when they'd first developed that particular product. And George had kept it in the display because, well, she understood why George had kept it in the display. She'd stood outside the shop looking at that label for longer than she'd meant to. This was the texture of it. This was what missing Fred was made of. Not the large moments, but the small ones. Not the thought of Fred is gone, but the specific sight of his handwriting on a label in a shop window. Not the abstract loss, but the concrete, ordinary, irreplaceable particular of him. She turned the extendable ear over again. The ink mark on the cord was near the receiver end, as she'd remembered. She wondered when it had got there. She wondered if Fred had ever held this specific one, or if George had, or if it had come off the production line without either of them touching it personally. It didn't matter, she supposed. It was theirs, the product of their making, their inventing, their ridiculous and brilliant collaboration. That was enough. She thought about George. She hadn't spoken to him properly since the week after the funeral. They'd been in the same rooms many times, had eaten at the same table, had exchanged the ordinary tokens of being in a family together. But they hadn't talked properly about Fred. She wasn't sure if George wanted that from her or needed to find it somewhere else, or somewhere inside himself, or nowhere yet. He had his own path through it, and she wasn't going to presume to know what he needed. But she thought about him now, living in the flat above the shop that he'd reopened, walking past Fred's handwriting on labels. She thought about how quiet he'd been all summer, a different quality of quiet from his ordinary self. George had always been noisy. Both of them had always been noisy. Their noise had been half the background of her childhood. And this summer George had been there and been present and been trying in a way she recognized and respected and found almost unbearable to witness. She should write to him. She'd been meaning to write to him since she arrived, had put it off in the way you put off things that mattered because the mattering made them harder to start. She'd write tomorrow. A proper letter, not the checking in kind. She'd tell him about the castle, about the repaired wall, about Maisie Fenn sitting next to her by the lake. She'd tell him that she'd found the extendable ear in the bottom of her trunk and that it had made her cry, because George deserved honesty from her more than he deserved her management of his feelings, and he knew what crying meant. It didn't need softening. She'd tell him she was glad the shop was open. She set the extendable ear carefully on her bedside table, not back in the trunk, not put away, just set there, in the open, where she could see it. It felt important not to put it away. It felt important to let it be present in the room, this small, ordinary thing that held the shape of someone specific. The amber light through the window had deepened toward orange. It would be dark in another hour, the September evening still coming in earlier than summer, the slow drift toward autumn asserting itself. She could hear the common room below her, still warm, still going, the ordinary noise of people being alive at the end of a Thursday. She thought about the year her family had, not in sequence. She still couldn't do that, not reliably, but in pieces, the way she'd been sitting with it since May. Her mum's face when it happened, her dad's hands on the table, George's quiet, her own quiet, the private version she'd kept separate from everyone else's quiet, because everyone was holding their own, and there wasn't space for all of it in the same room at the same time. She thought about the way Fred had laughed. She'd been thinking about this specifically, trying to hold on to the specifics before they softened into generalities, before he became funny rather than the particular way he was funny, before the memory preserved the quality but lost the detail. She'd read somewhere, Hermione's healer article, possibly, or something else from that summer of careful reading about grief, that memories changed, that the emotional memory was preserved longer than the specific sensory ones, that you kept the feeling of someone after you'd started to lose the exact sound of their voice or the specific quality of their laugh. She didn't want to lose the specific quality of his laugh. It had been loud, first of all, unself-conscious, the laugh of someone who found things genuinely funny rather than performing finding them funny. It had had a rhythm to it, a slight pause before it peaked, and it had made other people laugh because it was the kind of laugh that wasn't contained in whoever was doing it. It spread. She'd grown up with that laugh in the background of everything. It had been part of the sound of the burrow, the way the clock was part of the sound of the burrow, always there, noticed mostly in its absence. She was noticing it in its absence. She took a breath and held it for a moment and let it go. The extendable ear sat on her bedside table, flesh-colored cord, an ink mark, small and specific and entirely itself. She thought he would have had something to say about all of this. He would have. She knew it with complete certainty. He'd have had something that walked the line between acknowledgement and deflation, something that saw the weight of the situation and made it very slightly lighter without pretending it wasn't heavy. He'd been good at that his entire life, good at finding the angle from which things that were genuinely terrible were also, in some narrow, specific way, slightly absurd. And that absurdity wasn't disrespect, but relief, a pinhole of air in something suffocating. She couldn't replicate it. No one could. That had been his, specific to him, untransferable. But she could remember it. She could hold the memory of it with the particular care you gave to things you knew were finite. Not clutching, which distorted them, but carrying them with attention, which preserved them better. She could tell George about it, and George would add something, and between them, they'd keep more of the specific texture of Fred than either of them could hold alone. That was what family did with the uns they'd lost, she thought. Held the pieces between them, kept them whole by distribution. She heard footsteps on the stairs. She quickly pressed her fingers to her eyes, not ashamed of having been crying, but not wanting to have to explain it before she was ready to. The dormitory door opened, and it was Priya, her dormitory mate, stopping in the doorway with a natural tact that Ginny had already come to appreciate. "Oh, sorry, I just came up for my transfiguration notes." "It's fine," Ginny said. "Come in." Priya came in, went to her own bedside table with efficient purpose, paused for barely a moment on her way back out. Her eyes went to the extendable ear on Ginny's table. "Weasley's Wizard Wheezes," she said. "Yes." A brief, understanding pause. "My cousin had one of the decoy detonators," Priya said. "Used it at Christmas once. The whole house went mad trying to find what was making the noise." She smiled, small and genuine. "He still has it." "Good," Ginny said. And meant it. Meant it in a way that was bigger than one word could contain. But the one word was enough. Priya went back downstairs. Ginny listened to her footsteps descend, and the murmur of the common room briefly louder as the door at the bottom opened, and then quieter as it closed. She sat in the dormitory for another few minutes, in the orange evening light, in the particular quality of being alone in a room that was about to be occupied, the brief private space before the ordinary resumed. The extendable ear was there on the table. It would be there tomorrow morning when she woke up. She'd decided, without deciding, that it would stay there for the year. Not a shrine, not a statement, just a small, specific object in the room where she slept, a piece of something she was carrying that didn't need to be hidden away. She thought about the letter she'd write George tomorrow. She thought about what she'd say. She thought about the Weasley's Wizard Wheezes shop in Diagon Alley with the label in the window, and George walking past it every day, and the way he'd said at dinner Fred would have wanted it open with the careful voice of someone who had decided something important and needed to say it out loud to make it real. She thought, he's right. Fred would have wanted it open. Fred would have wanted all of this, she thought. Not the war, not the cost, not the grief. He'd have been furious about the cost, she knew, with the specific fury of someone who loved people and had been failed by a world that should have protected them. But the after, the coming back, the reopened shop and the repaired walls and the first years sitting there sorting and the people gathering themselves back into something. He'd have had something gently, precisely absurd to say about all of it. She stood up, finally, and smoothed her robes, and looked at the extendable ear once more. Very useful for eavesdropping on adults who think they're terribly important and secret. "Yeah," she said, quietly, to no one. It was. She went downstairs to the common room, where the fire was going, and Neville was arguing good-naturedly with someone about herbology, and the evening was ordinary and ongoing, and hers to be present in. She was still carrying the weight of it. She expected she always would, in some form. Not as something that crushed her, but as something she'd learned to carry, adjusted to its shape, found her balance with. You didn't put grief down, she understood now. You got stronger, and it felt lighter, and eventually It became part of how you stood. She sat in the armchair nearest the fire and let the warmth of the room reach her, and did not think about very much, and that was enough. She hadn't planned to go to the tryouts. That wasn't entirely true. She'd known they were happening, had seen the notice on the common room board since Monday, had read it twice with the particular feeling of something pulling at the edge of your attention that you weren't quite ready to act on. Gryffindor Quidditch, tryouts, Saturday 10 a.m. All positions open. See McLagan if interested. She'd stood in front of that notice on Tuesday morning with her bag over her shoulder and thought, not yet, maybe not at all. Then Saturday came and she was standing on the pitch at 9:45 with her clean sweep in her hand, and she wasn't entirely sure how she'd got there. The pitch was unchanged. That was the first thing. The same hoops, the same stands, the same quality of open sky above it that existed nowhere else at Hogwarts. This particular feeling of exposure and possibility that she'd always associated with being on a broom. The grass was freshly cut, still damp from early morning, and the smell of it hit her as she walked through the entrance, and she stopped for just a moment, breathing it in. This was hers. Whatever else the year was asking of her, whatever the castle required, and the lessons required, and the weight of being visible required, this had always been hers in a way nothing else quite was. Not because she was exceptional, though she was good, genuinely good, had worked to be good, but because flying was the one place where she stopped thinking in words entirely. The broom under her hands, the ground dropping away, the air. Her mind went quiet in a way it went quiet nowhere else. She needed that. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed it until she was standing here. There were perhaps 12 others trying out, a range of years, some familiar faces, and some she placed only vaguely. They gathered in the loose, slightly awkward cluster of people who didn't yet know which of them would matter to each other. McLagan, 6th year, captain this year, earnest in a way that was almost aggressive, ran through positions and requirements with a clipboard that he was taking seriously enough for 2 people. Ginny half listened and looked up at the sky. Clear, today. The September blue had deepened over the week, the air carrying that first edge of genuine autumn chill that you didn't get in the south. Above the pitch it was limitless, which inside the castle would have been uncomfortable, but up here felt like the correct amount of space. She mounted her broom. The moment she was in the air, everything became simpler. Not easier, simpler. Reduced to immediate, physical things. The drag of wind, the angle of the broom, the horizon leveling itself as she found her altitude and settled. She'd been at this height 100 times, and her body knew what to do here, knew how to adjust without her having to instruct it, and she let it, let the muscle memory take over, while some other part of her went quietly still. She flew circuits first, straight forward, feeling out her legs and arms, the looseness in her shoulders. She'd flown over the summer, once, on her own, above the paddock at the Burrow on a July evening, for about 20 minutes before she'd come back down and gone inside. But she hadn't properly flown, hadn't opened it up and let herself move with any real intention. She opened it up now. The acceleration pushed her back against the broom, clean and uncomplicated, and she went at it, not recklessly, but fully, banking into turns with the slight lean she'd learned at 11 and refined over 6 years, reading the air, responding to it. Below her, the pitch and the other flyers reduced to peripheral detail, the stands empty and watching, with a particular attentive quality of empty things. She turned hard left, dove slightly, felt the broom respond with the precise aliveness the good equipment had, and for approximately 30 seconds, she was not a Symbol or a Weasley or a post-war student navigating a complicated year. She was just a person on a broomstick who was good at this. The tryouts themselves lasted just under 2 hours. McLaggen ran drills, time seekers, put the chasers through a series of passing patterns that were competent, if slightly unimaginative. Ginny played chaser with the loose efficiency of someone for whom the technical requirements were automatic, which freed her to read the other players, to know where the quaffle would be before it arrived, to make the adjustments that separated a good player from a useful one. She didn't try to lead. That wasn't why she was here. She kept her edges in, played her own game, passed cleanly when passing was right, and held when it wasn't. McLaggen noticed. She could tell. He marked something on his clipboard twice while watching her. But she didn't play for the clipboard. She played because she was here and had a broom, and the sky was open. When it ended and they landed, she stood on the grass with her broom in her hand and felt the specific physical exhaustion of having used her body properly after a long time of mostly just carrying her mind around. Her legs were good tired. Her shoulders ached in a way that was entirely different from the tension she'd been carrying in them all week. She was cold through her robes and slightly out of breath, and her hair had completely escaped whatever she'd done with it this morning. She felt, for the first time since arriving, something that was recognizably herself. Neville fell into step beside her on the path back to the castle. He'd been in the stands, she realized. She'd noticed him vaguely in her peripheral vision at some point during the trials, sitting alone with his hands in his pockets with the expression of someone who was there in moral support rather than out of any particular interest in Quidditch. He'd brought a herbology textbook that appeared to be unopened. They walked in comfortable quiet for a moment. The path back from the pitch ran alongside the edge of the forbidden forest, the trees dark even in daylight, the border between school and everything else. "You looked good up there," Neville said. "I looked like myself," she said, which is the same thing at this point. Nodded. Then, after a moment, in a different tone, the tone he'd been developing all week, the one that said, "I'm going to say something real, and you can decide what to do with it. I've been having the dream again." She looked at him. "The one about the battle," he said. He kept his eyes on the path. Different each time, but same quality to it. "I wake up, and I know it wasn't exactly what happened, but the feeling is right. The feeling is exactly right." She was quiet for a moment. The path curved, and the castle came back into view, solid and lit against the late afternoon. "Me too," she said. He nodded once, as if he'd suspected but had needed to hear it from someone else. "I spoke to Madame Pomfrey," he said. "She said it's normal, that it may continue for some time." "Yes, that's not entirely comforting." "No," she agreed, "but it's better than not knowing why." They passed the section of path where the forest came closest to the castle walls, and she could smell the trees, that cold, dark green smell, the forest keeping its own counsel as it always had. She'd been in there 3 times in 7 years and hadn't enjoyed any of them. She had no plans to make it 4. Neville said, I think it's going to be all right, eventually. I know it is, she said, not because she felt it completely yet, but because she decided to believe it, which was a different thing. And sometimes the decision was what you had to work with while the feeling caught up. They came around the corner to the entrance courtyard, and the castle opened its arms in the way it always did at this angle. All towers and lit windows, and the smell of stone in cold air. She looked at it. She thought about the repaired wall on the second floor, lighter stone, cleaner mortar. She thought about how she'd put her hand against it on the first night and held her palm flat against the new stones. She thought about Maisie Fenn by the lake and the extendable ear on her bedside table and Luna saying, "You can just live in it." She looked at the castle and did not look away from it. Not because it was easy, because it was hers, this complicated, costly, irreplaceable place. And looking away required more effort than looking at it. The wall had been repaired. The battle had been fought inside these walls, and the walls were still standing. And so was she, and so was Neville beside her, and so, in various states of ongoing reconstruction, were most of the things that mattered. Rebuilding looked like this, like two people walking back from a Quidditch pitch in the cold, like a letter she'd write to George tonight, like an extendable ear on a bedside table, like a first year reading a charms textbook by a lake, small, specific, ongoing. She walked through the castle doors and into the warmth. The common room emptied slowly. It always did on Saturday nights, people lingering longer than on weekdays. The fire kept high, conversations running past their natural endings because no one had an early lesson to justify going up. By 11, most of them had gone. By past, it was just Ginny in the armchair nearest the fire, her Transfiguration textbook open in her lap, unread. She'd been sitting here for a while. The fire had settled into itself, not the high, cheerful burn of earlier, but something lower and steadier, the kind of fire that had decided what it was doing and was doing it without any further announcement. She watched it. The common room around her was warm and quiet, all the small sounds of a lived-in place. The slight creak of the castle, the faint movement of air through old stone, the occasional soft pop from the grate. She thought about leaving. Not permanently. Not the dramatic version. Just going home. Writing McGonagall a letter in the morning. Collecting her trunk. Taking the train back to King's Cross. And letting her mum hold on as long as she needed to at the barrier. No one would blame her. McGonagall had said so, herself, in August, in that careful way she had of saying difficult things directly. There are provisions. No one would think less of you. She knew that was true. She also knew she wasn't going to do it. She sat with the knowing for a moment, turning it over, making sure it was real and not just habit or stubbornness or the performance of being someone who stayed. She checked it against the week just past. The Dada classroom and the 14 faces, the repaired wall and her palm flat against cold new stone. Maisie Fenn with a charms textbook and reddened eyes. The extendable ear on her bedside table. Neville saying "me too" on the path from the Quidditch pitch. It held up. She wasn't staying because she was fearless. She'd stopped believing in fearless somewhere around her second year, had understood definitively by her fifth that courage wasn't the absence of being afraid, but what you did while you were afraid. And she'd spent the 7th year of her education proving it to herself in conditions she had no interest in repeating. She wasn't staying for Harry either. She checked that one carefully too, because it mattered. It mattered that this be her decision about her life, not a decision made in the shape of someone else. Harry was in London making toast and writing letters with ink smudges and getting on with his own reconstruction, and she loved him, and he was not the reason. The reason was smaller than bravery and less romantic than love. She was unfinished here, not Hogwarts, unfinished in the sense of coursework or examinations, though those too, unfinished as a person, in the specific ways that this place and this year were the right conditions for finishing. She had things to learn that she could only learn by being present in the learning of them. She had people to sit next to, Maisie by the lake, Neville on the path, Luna watching for the squid, and those sittings were doing something she couldn't have anticipated and couldn't replicate anywhere else. The castle was paying attention, Luna had said. She thought that was probably true. She thought she was paying attention back. She pulled her Transfiguration textbook properly into her lap. Not because she intended to study tonight. It was past 11, and she was tired in the good way, the Quidditch way, but because it was hers, and she was here, and the act of holding it felt like a small, private declaration of something she didn't have a better word for than presence. The fire settled lower. The common room held its quiet around her. She was here. She was staying. Not because she was the brave one or the symbol or the girl people waited on for answers. Because she was Ginny Weasley, and she was 17, and this was her last year, and she was going to be present in it. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough. She closed the textbook, set it on the side table beside her, and sat for another few minutes in the warmth of the dying fire. Then she went up to bed.